Welcome back to the TimCo Retail Manager course. This course focuses on real-world application development. In this video, we're going to be deploying our API to Azure Web Apps. Once we get that up and running, a future video will cover how to automate this process. Now, Patreon members, just note that there is no source code for today's video since it is about deploying, but there will be for the next video, okay? And also previous videos are still on Patreon. Now, if you're not familiar with this project, let me explain a bit about it. We created the TimCo Retail Manager application as a set of simulations of the real world. Phase 1 started with a .NET Framework project and then upgraded to .NET Core in order to gain the experience of doing an upgrade like that of a real application. We completed that phase in November. If you want to get up to speed quickly on that phase, there's a link in the description to get the Phase 1 course. Now we're in Phase 2, where we're expanding the application and taking advantage of the development and deployment tools available to us. You see, I'm a firm believer in experience, and that comes through practice. And so we're going to practice these things, and then later, what you can do is take your project to the same process that you've seen me do and practiced having done once, and now you can practice doing it another time. This is how you grow as a C# developer. Not by watching videos, but by doing the work. Okay, so let's head over to our browser, and here is our Azure DevOps project. And I've also opened up my Azure portal. Now, if you don't have an Azure portal, you can get one of those for free, and it will give you a number of services for free or for very cheap. The web app we're going to develop today is going to be free. Okay, so this is free for life. You get the 10 free web apps. This will be one of those 10 that we'll use. And then there will be a little bit of cost for our SQL databases. We're going to do 2 SQL databases, so it'll be about $10 a month total, which when you sign up for Azure, it does give you some credits to use during the first, I believe, 30 days or 60 days, something like that. And you can use those to get started. And then also, if you have a subscription to Azure, then through Visual Studio Enterprise or your work or something else, you can get some monthly credits for free as well. So there is a lot of opportunity to get free stuff with Azure, and I want to show this as a deployment option. Even if you don't have access to it, you can at least see the process and understand that so that when you work for a company, you know how to do this. Okay? So we're going to start off by creating our web app so that can be running in the background and get set up while we go back over to our Visual Studio. Now I have a dashboard here, and what I do is whenever I do a video where there's a group of things together, I create a dashboard for it. And this is the same thing I would do for a customer or in the real world for my applications. In fact, there's a dashboard here. This dashboard, the main one, is my stuff, okay? But we're going to work on the TimCo dashboard. So this is for the TimCo project or the TimCo corporation. So let's create a resource. And if you're on this dashboard, when you say pin to dashboard, it's going to pin to this dashboard. So we're going to create a resource up here, and we're going to select web application or web app. And you have to have a subscription. So mine is a Visual Studio Enterprise subscription and a resource group. Now, resource groups are free. It's just a way of grouping things together. Think of them like buckets. And you can put things in a bucket, and it just kind of holds those things in the same spot. Maybe even think of this like a solution, where a solution just holds various projects in the same location or adjacent to each other. That's kind of what this resource group is. It's free. It's more for grouping things together than it is anything else. So you can think of a resource group as just that grouping. So I'll create a resource group for TimCo. So create new. I call it the TimCo Retail Manager. Actually, you know what? TimCo Resource Group. I get shorter. So now I know that anything in the TimCo Resource Group goes together. One of the benefits here is sometimes a service will create more than one item. And you're often left confused as to what is this thing, whether it's a network or something else where it's like, I didn't create that intentionally. It got created when I did something else, but I don't know what it was. Well, if it's in a resource group, you know at least where it came from or what it's associated with. So web app name, we're going to have the TimCo API. Let's see if that's available. It is. So the TimCo API is available, therefore we'll use this. Notice TimCo API, and then it's underneath that is .azurewebsites.net. So that's the full URL is going to be timcoapi.azurewebsites.net. Now, we're going to publish as code, not as a Docker container. I'm going to select the runtime stack of .NET Core 3.1, which is the long-term support version. And I'm going to choose to deploy to Linux. Now, I'm working on Windows, but .NET Core is cross-platform. And since I'm using an API, a core API, that's cross-platform. Therefore, I can deploy to Linux, which can be a bit faster and it's also cheaper sometimes. So we're just going to do it to Linux. And we're going to do East US 2. And that's just the region of the world. Choose a region of the world that is closest to you. Notice there's a long list here of different regions. Just choose one that's closest. And the reason why you choose the closest one to you, or actually to your customer, is because there is a speed issue when it comes to talking to these servers. Light can only move so fast, which seems silly because you think of light as instantaneous. We know it's not, but it's so fast we think it is. But the reality is, I'm on the east coast of the United States. If I chose an Australian server, I would have a somewhat noticeable lag because it's the speed of light. And it's going from one side of the world to the other and back. And that can add to your slowness. Okay, so just choose something that's close to your customers. If you have customers all over the world, pick your biggest concentration and put it there. And then maybe if you want to replicate somewhere else down the road, you could do that. But it's not the end of the world to be operating somewhere around halfway around the world, but it's not ideal. Okay, so I don't have a Linux plan in East US 2 yet. So I'm going to create one. I create a new one. So this is going to be the TimCo App Service Plan. Sounds good. Hit OK. And then I choose the SKU and size. So I hit change here because if I leave it alone, it's going to cost me $73.73 a month. That's not ideal, especially not for a demo app. Instead, I'm going to go to Dev Test up here, and there's the F1 plan in orange. That's the 1 gigabyte of memory, 60 minutes per day of compute, and it's free. So this is the bare bones minimum, but it's free. So you get to try something out. And that's all you really need for development or for just starting out. One of the things I always encourage people is don't start your application development lifecycle by buying stuff. First, start by writing your code. So if you don't have your code written yet, don't buy the stuff that's going to support it. The one exception might be the domain name. Because domain names, you don't want to bank on this domain name when it's no longer there. So you might have to change all your wording in your application to be something else. So a domain name itself might be something you buy ahead of time. That's about $10 US. But otherwise, everything else should wait until you're ready. Otherwise, you're going to be paying for months and months and months of a web host you never use. So this is a great option even for getting started, because then if this application is still in development but I want to see it on a real server, I can do this and it's free. And I haven't invested anything as far as money goes in this project. I can still play around with it. And once I'm ready, then I can move to the production level sites that have a lot more options for me. Okay, so I hit apply on the free version. And I'll hit review and create. And that's going to get me set up. It's going to say, okay, you want the East US 2, you want a Linux plan, it's free, 1 gigabyte of memory, and it's the .NET Core 3.1. It's a code deploy. The name is going to be TimCo API. We're all good there. So I hit create. and it's going to initialize that process and start building out what I need to. It's going to build out resource group, and it's going to build out the web app as well. Now it's going to take a little bit of time, so let's go over to our source code. One of the things I want to show you is I open up the solution file again, and note if I go to Team Explorer, there's those 6 options again as all. So I have to go back to Manage Connections, double click on the TimCo Retail Manager, and then that will give me my additional connections to Azure DevOps. So just know that if you get there and there's only those 6 instead of the 9 that you're expecting, that's why. So I just want to show that to you because that's something that I ran into when I was doing this. All right, so that should be enough time to create our product, and yes, it is. So now our API website has been created. So if we go here, we can actually pin that to the dashboard and then go back to our dashboard and see there's our TimCo Retail API or TimCo API. If we click the URL for it, it's going to take us to the standard welcome page. Okay, so let's make sure this loads. It takes a couple seconds the first time because it's just spooling up our web server. So just note that the first time should be an anomaly. Now we are using the free server, so we're not going to put a ton of resources towards our product. So it's going to be a little slow compared to a quote-unquote real web server. But there are ways you can optimize it. In fact, a free website can actually be super powerful and can host a lot of people if you do things right with a caching service like Cloudflare or something else. But I would say upgrade at least one level if you're going to do any kind of real application. All right, so there's our basic page. Just remember that. That's what it looks like, the basic page. Notice it does have a certificate. It is secure. So that's it. So that's our website or API website, but it's not yet deployed. There's no code there yet. So let's go back to Visual Studio. And you may have heard the phrase, friends don't let friends right-click deploy. That's not really true. It's true in the fact that you don't want to do this for production. But the right-click deploy is a great option inside Visual Studio for development. It gets you up to speed fast, and really even for a small project you're not doing that many deploys on, it might be fine even for production. I'm not going to hold that against you, but I would say that automation is probably better, so we're going to go that route eventually. But to get started, we want to just get something up. So I'm going to right-click and say Publish, and we're going to choose to publish to an app service on Linux. And we're going to say Select Existing, and it's going to talk to my subscription for Azure. Notice you could deploy to a virtual machine, or a Windows app service, a regular app service, or IIS. You can FTP the files. You can even put them in just a folder and then copy them manually. We're going to do this app service process right now. And inside here, I have my list, and here's my TimCo API. That's the only Linux app service I have, so that's the one I'm going to choose. I hit OK, and it's going to create a published profile for me. Now I can review this and make sure that it's what I want. So for example, I click this little pencil here, and it says, okay, it's a release configuration of .NET Core 3.1. It's framework dependent, meaning you have to have .NET Core 3.1 on the server. That's okay. And the runtime target is portable versus one of these different types. Okay, so we're going to leave that all alone and hit cancel actually. We could change the connection strings. Notice the connection strings right here, which right now they're local DB. And we're going to talk about that in just a minute, but we're not going to change those right now. So I'm going to hit publish. What this will do is it will build my project and publish my application. Now notice I'm publishing my API project. I'm not publishing my library or my WPF application or anything else. The API is what I want, and that API will bring with it the DLLs it needs, including the DLL from my library project. Now it takes us to this site, and it looks the same. Well, give it a second, because it's going to take a couple of seconds to load up. But while we do, let's go back over here and kind of look through this output. Notice that, let's scroll to the very top here. So it first does a build. So it builds the library first, and it gets that DLL. Then it's going to do a build of the actual API. And it's going to bring that DLL in from the library. And then from there, it's going to do a publish. And this is where it publishes up all the files we need, the DLLs for our application, creates the directories it needs, and then adds the files that it needs and pushes that all up to the correct locations on our web server. This is why I love Azure. Azure is really easy mode because all this was done for me. All the configuration, all the tweaking and all the rest. And it's just simple. Now, a lot of you have asked about IaaS deploy. And I'll probably do a video on that at some point in the near future where I show you how to deploy to an IaaS server and maybe even configure it, because IaaS is not simple. Okay? Yes, from the Visual Studio side, it's kind of simple. You can deploy to a folder or even directly to IaaS, but that's just half the battle. In fact, that's the small half, because then in IaaS, you have to configure the website correctly. You have to set up the certificates if it needs SSL, which it should. You need to do a lot of configuration on permissions on the disk and all the rest in order to get it all set up. Look at the app pools and make sure they're correct. Make sure that's pointing to the right type of .NET version. So it just can be complicated. Whereas with this, it's all set up for us. In fact, we deployed to Linux, which I am not a Linux guru. I haven't used Linux in any serious capacity for years. I use it in and out here and there, but nothing serious for years. And yet, I just deployed to a Linux box. I created a Linux instance, which is going to be running Apache, and then I push my code to it, and I configured it all, which I probably wouldn't know how to do manually. All right, hit refresh, and now we see that we're on the API. Notice it does say not secure, but I believe if you do a refresh, or let's just do this, type HTTPS. Now it's, there we go. Now it's on the secured site. And in fact, I believe if you go back now to HTTP, it will redirect you back to the secured site. Yes. So it took a bit to get started on here, but now it's configured and running, and we have our API on Azure. So timcoapi.azurewebsites.net. But notice that if I go to log in, let's just log in with test@test.com and test123 and hit login. It's going to give you a nasty error message. And it doesn't give me any good information about the error. It just says an error occurred while processing your request. And it says development mode, swap to development environment to display more information about the error. So basically, this is just a secure error page for users to see. It doesn't give them any information about what's going on behind the scenes, which is great for our users, not so great for us in development. So what we need to do is change to a development environment. That's this variable right here, switch to development, and then it will give us a development error message. Now that error message, I already know what it's going to say, or roughly. It's basically going to say, I don't know where that database is, because remember that our database is pointed at local DB. So if we go down here in our API on Azure, and there is the, this is not available for Linux apps. Okay, so if we were to open up this app service editor, which is kind of nice for Windows apps evidently, but what it does allows us to see all the files. We can actually see them without having to SSH into the box or do other things like that. But what it will allow us to do is see the files. We can actually open up our web config, or I'm sorry, app settings.json file, and we'd see that it's not pointing to the right location. There is no database it's pointing to. It doesn't exist on this server. So in the next video, and I wanted to separate these out so they are separate, we're going to create our two SQL servers that we need. Remember, we need one for our authentication system, and we need one for our actual data for the TimCo Retail Manager. We'll create those two databases in the next video, and then what we're going to do is under configuration, there's this connection strings thing. And what you can do is you can add a connection string, and what will happen is it will override a connection string that's in your web app with this value. And so we can override our connection string with the correct one that points to the Azure SQL, which means that our source code doesn't have to change. Notice our source code, if we go to the appsettings.json file, there's our connection strings. But if we name them the same in the portal, so default connection and TRM data, if we name them the same here and say, okay, this is default connection, here's the value for it, and oh, by the way, it's a SQL Server, actually we get a SQL Azure, then we can connect to that when we are on Azure, but we don't have those credentials when we're not on Azure, and that's a security thing. So that's the easiest way of going about it. Again, Azure can be really easy mode. We don't have to do config transforms. We don't have to do a separate key system like a key vault or something else if we don't want to. So that's what we're going to do in the next video. We're going to set up our SQL servers and then set up our connection string so our API can point to that correct location. Once we have that done, then we can go back to Azure DevOps and we can start doing our pipelines, where we start doing a build process and then our release process can do the same right-click publish that we did, only can do it automatically and in a repeatable manner. So that's coming up. We'll do that in a couple of videos once we have everything on Azure. I do like to get everything on Azure first and get it running, because my thought process is that if you don't have everything running on Azure, then you don't know when there's a problem. You don't know if it's your build process or your deployment process, or if it is the Azure configuration. So if you have everything in Azure working with the manual deployments, then you know that Azure is set up correctly. Then all you need to worry about is making sure your deployment process is working correctly so that the end result is a fully working system. Okay? So that's our process going forward. But for right now, I'm going to stop the video right here and we'll move on to the next lesson where we'll talk about our SQL deployments. Okay? Thanks for watching. And as always, I am Tim Corey.